I'd like to welcome you to our STS-31 post-launch news conference. Our players from your left are KSC Launch Director Bob Seek and George T. Sassine, Director of Shuttle Engineering. We'll start off with Mr. Seek.
Well, we're obviously pleased to be here after a long effort to get the Hubble, the shuttle, into orbit, and that was accomplished today through the work of a lot of people. The countdown process since yesterday really went well. We were concerned about the weather early on. The severe weather which we thought might impact us stayed away, and the launch conditions and the landing conditions were all acceptable when we went into terminal count. And we really had very few problems. We stayed on the timeline all night. We did send a crew into the launch pad to verify the setting of some circuit breakers on the ground system, but we ingressed the crew on time, went right into terminal count, had one what would appear to be funny or glitch on a computer display, which was an explained condition due to the computer timing at that moment, and went into terminal count ready to go on time. As you know, we stopped at 31 seconds, which again is a reminder of the complexity of the system, but also that the systems work whenever all the prerequisites are not satisfied, and we stop and we hold and we evaluate the condition, and if we can fix it, we continue on. If not, we don't launch. Well, today we were able to fix it. The software sensed that a valve was not in the right position, which it was not because the command hadn't gotten through. The engineers responsible for that system backed up the command, positioned the valve correctly, verified that everything else in their system was in the proper configuration, and we picked up the count and launched safely and successfully. And I think that's a testimony to the way the system should work, the hardware, the software, and the people. And it all has to be right before we commit to launch, and that was done to everyone's satisfaction today. So we feel good about that. We feel good about the hardware that we put on orbit, and we're looking forward to the results.
Ted?
I had hoped to be able to come over here today and tell you absolutely nothing about a totally boring, perfect launch count. I almost made it. And it was really a very routine count. Everything worked beautifully. The problem that got us in the dying minutes, I will see if I can explain without making it too complicated. About 12 years ago or so, when the liquid oxygen system was in its infancy and people were thinking about it, they worried about closing the fill and drain valves, which are fairly good-sized valves, against any sort of pressure. So we built a little set of logic in the software called prerequisite logic, and it looks at 3 or 4 things and says all these got to be right before you could do something. And that's what was looking at the LOX outboard fill and drain valve when this happened. About 3 weeks ago, another event caught up to us. We had an old rusty water pipe in one of the outbuildings that sprayed on a motor control assembly that had 4,000 volts in it. Well, the explosion caused a pretty good ringing on the buses around here, and it took down an LPS control room in about 2 cycles. So we had a whole bunch of what-if meetings, as anybody would do, and said, what are you going to do if this catches you at the very wrong time? And the liquid oxygen people made it loud and clear. If we can't drain within 9 minutes of stopping flow, the system will do what is called geysering. And I'm sure you're all familiar with geysers and how they work. And that will destroy the tank. The only other choice you would have to do then without LPS is open this valve and dump that head of LOX into an absolutely empty pipe. Now, you're all familiar with water hammer in your houses. LOX is heavier than water. And we have a great big filter, and we could undoubtedly rupture some plumbing if we did that. So the fix was to put a purge in that line and put a small gas pad in there. And we did that by hand after the inboard valve was closed and before the outboard valve was closed. The ground launch sequencer sent its closed outboard command at 48 seconds. The LOX console says you don't meet my prerequisite because you have this purge valve open. And so it said don't close. Long ago, we had ceased to worry about closing that valve against purge pressure, but we had never really fixed the software because it never bothered us before. And I guess this time we violated one of our own cardinal rules that says never ever make a software change unless you can run it many, many times. And we keep getting reminded that this is the most complicated toy ever built by mankind. And all the complication doesn't fly, half of it stays here on Earth. So anyway, to reaffirm Bob's point, though, the software would have saved us completely. Of course, we wouldn't have launched. So we're going back again and carefully review some cardinal rules and carefully review why we're never going to deviate from them again. That's really about all I got to tell you about it. It was about 10 seconds after it happened, everybody looked around and said, oh boy, were we dumb. And they knew exactly what to do, and they did it. And that's kind of our story. I think the launch was beautiful. I hope the mission will be an equal success, because to me, this is probably the shuttle program's most significant mission. I'm a real enthusiast of the Hubble Space Telescope. That's really all I have to tell you. I'm sorry it wasn't more boring.
We can take questions at this time. Please wait for the mic and give your name and affiliation. Dan?
Dan Billow, WESH-TV. So, George, did you have to fix something, or did you have to just realize, oh, it's okay, let's tell it that it doesn't need to do anything?
We simply bypassed the prerequisite step in the logic and sent the close command. We didn't have to fix anything.
Harry? 1 second, please.
Harry Colcom, Aviation Week. Ted, was this how did you send it? What method did you use? Did you manually bypass the computer or what?
No. Our launch processing computerized system has a bunch of ways you can manually send commands. It is not a switch with a wire. The guy puts his cursor on the valve and presses the button, says enter, and the cursor sends the command through the computer system.
Phil?
Okay. Philip Chen for Astronomy. Bob, we've seen the shuttle as a fantastic machine, but also as a machine where everything has to be working 100% every time at liftoff. You have to have all 3 APUs operational in both high and low speed modes, and every other system has to be operational. Can we get to the stage when we're like an aircraft, where we have a list of things which aren't as necessary, or where we have redundancies, so we can only need, say, 2 out of 3 APUs operational?
I don't think you'll ever see the program to the point where we will give up our redundancy on the ground where it has to do with a critical system like APUs, main propulsion, and life support systems. The redundancy is built into the vehicle. It was designed that way to be used on orbit to complete the mission and to land safely. And our approach to that is we're going to save it for that, and we're going to make it 100% before it leaves the ground. And I think the record shows that when we have stopped, scrubbed, or terminated the launch count, it's for those reasons that you did not want to launch that day.
We'll take one more question here before moving to Houston. Dan?
Yes, Bob, when were you or was the test director notified that this system was not closed, and was that the proper time to have been notified, or should you have known minutes before that it wasn't closed?
No, the command doesn't get sent until within -1 minute, and when the command didn't get through, we all got instantaneous notification that it didn't make it, and of course we have the built-in hold point of 31 seconds to work the problem. And that part of the system all worked. Is what Ted said was if there's any deficiency in a training simulation sometime back in the flow prior to going into launch countdown, this would have been the time to catch it, so we wouldn't have had hold in our launch count.
Do we have a question at JSC?
Okay, this is the Johnson Space Center, John Gardner. John Getter, KHOU-TV. For George, if I understood you correctly there, you were saying that essentially you got caught because you violated some of your own practices and rules and explained why they're so important. I'd like to ask you a question we've asked astronauts and others periodically, and that is, are you at all concerned that there is any kind of a tendency developing to start skirting any of those rules, bending them, or trying to get around them when they're not convenient?
Well, the first answer is a direct no. That tendency has not been apparent. The rule we actually violated was one of sufficient magnitude of testing to catch the problem. When you make a software change, as the folks in Houston will tell you, you must run this many, many times because there are oddities about software changes that you don't always get the first time through. And the basic rule we violated is we did not test it enough. And we're going to go back and reaffirm how much it actually takes before you can do something like this. But no, there has not been a laxity here about relaxing those kind of rules. Maybe the rule was not quite stringent enough to begin with.
Do we have any additional questions from JSC?
That's all the questions from JSC.
Coming back to KSC, Jim.
Jim Banky, Florida Today. Bob or Ted, could either of you review some of the other problems that occupied your attention before you got to this T-31 and talk a little bit about the ice and this plug and whatnot that was going on?
Well, I can address the ice issue, and in all our launch count procedures, we do a visual ice inspection remotely with television and hands-on crew, and the criteria is essentially no ice that could potentially impact the orbiter in the sensitive critical tile areas. What was different in this launch count, we noticed a little larger buildup of ice on the hydrogen umbilical between the orbiter and the tank. We always see some ice there. If it is of the nature that it's soft or it's mostly frost, then we just, we essentially ignore it from the standpoint of being a threat. This time there was more of it out there, so it attracted more attention. We suspect that the ice and the frost, probably more like slush, was building up due to a leak around a closeout plug that is inserted in the insulative foam because that's an access area for a ground checkout tool. And the plug was put in, and in the first tank cycle, we saw very little ice around there, so we felt the plug was holding good. Obviously, the cold shock, as it were, on that line opened up some gaps around the plug, and we got more ice this time. So the discussion was, do we have too much ice? Would it be an unsafe condition? The answer to that was no. And secondly, would we be concerned about the plug coming out? And the answer to that was no. But that's why that's why it took up. It had the management involvement routine, as it were, in launch count, and that's the only one, as Ted would characterize the launch count from the standpoint of training and non-standard work. It was uneventful.
Paul?
Paul Hooverston, USA Today. Question for Ted. You've got Columbia sitting out on the pad, and do you expect to have enough of these software tests run before you launch that one, or you're going to be cutting it close, or what's going to happen?
I may just pull this procedure if there isn't time. The procedure was a response to what I would call almost a non-problem. The power system around this place is pretty well built, and we rarely blow up 4,000 kVA motor control assemblies. Most of the time, our uninterruptible power system saves us. This time it had some extra positive ringing, and half our units are 10 years old, and they just didn't protect. I really don't think it's prudent to put a lot of effort into planning for a total LPS loss between 31 seconds and T0. And I think if we look at this procedure, we'll just probably pull it for now until we can put the proper testing on it.
Beth?
Beth Dickey with Reuters. Ted, I'm just a little unclear on why it is this software change was not tested enough. Is that because your rules don't require a certain number of tests, or were you trying to save time?
And I guess the answer to both of them has to be yes. We probably have not specifically specified the number of tests. I know we have a certain amount we run, but maybe we ought to say there ought to be more. And it was a little late in the game when all this happened. And really, all of those experts who should have been smart enough just weren't. Still want to emphasize, the software safed the system like it's supposed to. You can't make it unsafe. And the only thing would have happened, we wouldn't have launched.
Gentleman in the back row.
Kevin Dunn from NBC News. I'm a little mixed up. Was this purge valve on the shuttle, on the tank, or on the ground? Where is the physical position of the valve that got?
I'm going to guess, but I believe it's on the ground.
It's not a problem on the shuttle now. They left it behind them.
Well, it wouldn't have been a problem anyway, no matter where it was.
I mean, it's not a sticky valve sitting up at
No.
the
It was commanded to be opened deliberately. And when it got down to the final command for the outboard fill and drain, that logic wanted to be commanded closed. There was nothing wrong with the valve.
Do you have any additional questions?
Hi, do we know what the orbital parameters... Sorry, Nick Booth from the Observer in London. Do we know what the orbital parameters are, and is there any engineering data from the mirror? How is it... What's its shape, anything like that?
We can get the orbital parameters from JSC, Nick. Do you have any additional questions?
Also go.
Roger, Houston, we copy.